Remove that fake metal before I hold you in contempt. Judge Margaret Halston's voice cracked across the silent courtroom like a rifle shot. Every head turned toward the old man in the wheelchair. Sergeant Major Thomas Whitaker, 86 years old, didn't even blink. His weathered hands rested calmly on the wheels beside the faded blue ribbon hanging from his neck. The Medal of Honor looked small against his wrinkled suit jacket, but somehow heavier than the entire room. "Sir," his young public defender whispered nervously, "maybe just take it off for now." Tom never looked at him. His pale blue eyes stayed fixed on the American flag, standing in the corner beneath the fluorescent lights. Judge Halston leaned forward. "You think wearing a fake military medal is going to make this court pity you?" A few people in the gallery shifted uncomfortably. One bailiff stepped closer to the wheelchair. "Your Honor," the defender tried again. "That medal appears to be authentic." "Appears," the judge snapped. "I'm tired of old men pretending to be heroes." That word hit harder than anyone realized. Pretending. Tom's fingers brushed the metal gently, and suddenly the courtroom disappeared. Snow blasted across a frozen Korean hillside. Mortars thundered through the darkness. 20-year-old Thomas Whitaker dragged a bleeding lieutenant through waist-deep snow while machine gun fire shredded the trees behind them. "Leave me," the lieutenant screamed. But Tom kept pulling him forward with blood freezing on his gloves. Back in the courtroom, the old veteran slowly lifted his eyes toward the judge. "This medal," he said quietly, "was pinned on me by a president who cried while doing it." The room went dead silent. In the back row, Assistant U.S. Attorney Nathan Brooks stared at the medal, his heartbeat suddenly hammering. He recognized the name. Whitaker. His father once told him about a classified operation in Korea where one man held a mountain pass alone for 6 straight hours. Nathan quietly stepped into the hallway and made a call. "Dad, I think I just found him." 3 minutes later, inside the Pentagon, General Richard Caldwell froze mid-briefing when he heard the name Thomas Whitaker. "Get my car ready," the 4-star general ordered instantly. Back in court, Judge Halston slammed her gavel. "Bailiff, remove that medal now." The bailiff reached toward Tom's chest just as the courtroom doors burst open. "Take that fake medal off before I have you removed from my courtroom." Judge Margaret Halston's voice sliced through the stale morning air with the sharpness of a command barked on a parade ground. The fluorescent lights overhead hummed softly, washing courtroom for B in a pale gray glow that made every tired face look even older. At the center of the room, seated quietly in a worn black wheelchair, Sergeant Major Thomas Whitaker slowly lifted his eyes toward the bench. He was 86 years old. His silver hair was neatly combed. His dark navy suit had been pressed carefully, though the cuffs were frayed with age. Around his neck hung a faded blue ribbon carrying a small star-shaped medal that caught the courtroom lights for only a second before settling back against his chest. The Medal of Honor. The judge leaned back in her leather chair, irritation spreading across her face. "I'm speaking to you, Mr. Whitaker." Tom said nothing. Silence had become natural to him decades ago. It was the kind of silence forged in frozen mountains, jungle rain, and long nights where men learned that panic killed faster than bullets ever could. A nervous public defender beside him cleared his throat softly. "Your Honor," Ethan Cole began carefully, "my client is here over a clerical dispute with the VA hospital." Not what?" Judge Halston snapped. "Not exploiting military sympathy." A few uncomfortable murmurs rippled through the gallery benches. Tom remained motionless. His weathered hands rested lightly on the wheels of his chair, veins standing beneath skin worn thin by time. The old veteran's pale blue eyes drifted toward the American flag standing beside the courtroom seal. The fabric barely moved in the stale recycled air. "I've seen this before," the judge continued coldly. "Old men wearing fake medals hoping nobody checks." The bailiff shifted uneasily near the aisle. Even he seemed uncomfortable with the direction the hearing was taking. Tom finally spoke, his voice low and rough like gravel under heavy boots. "That medal was given to me in 1958. Judge Halston gave a short, humorless laugh. "And I'm supposed to believe that?" Her gavel tapped once against the bench. Sharp. Final. "Because from where I'm sitting, it looks like costume jewelry." The words hung in the courtroom like smoke after a rifle shot. For the briefest moment, something changed behind Tom Whitaker's eyes. Not anger. Something deeper. Older. a memory stirring awake beneath decades of silence. His fingers moved slowly toward the metal resting against his chest as cold wind, snow, and the distant sound of artillery began rising once again from a place he had spent 70 years trying to forget. The courtroom faded around him like smoke carried off by winter wind. 1 second Thomas Whitaker sat beneath fluorescent lights and polished oak walls. The next, he was 20 years old again, kneeling in knee-deep snow beneath a sky the color of cold steel. The air in North Korea had burned his lungs with every breath. Frost clung to his eyebrows. His gloves were stiff with frozen blood that was not entirely his own. Somewhere beyond the ridge line, artillery rolled through the mountains like distant thunder. Young Lieutenant James Caldwell lay against a shattered pine tree, his breathing shallow and uneven beneath layers of torn winter gear. He could not have been older than 24. "You should leave me here, Sergeant," the lieutenant whispered through chattering teeth. "That is an order." Tom remembered the sound of the wind more than anything else. It screamed through the valley without mercy, carrying snow across the mountain in long white sheets that swallowed footprints within seconds. He remembered tightening his grip on the rescue rope around his shoulder and shaking his head once. "Respectfully, sir," he had answered quietly. "That is one order I cannot follow." Back in the courtroom, Tom's hand remained resting against the metal hanging from his neck. His eyes never left the American flag in the corner. Judge Halston mistook his silence for weakness. "This court does not have time for dramatic performances," she said sharply. "If that medal is legitimate, you can provide documentation like everyone else." Ethan Cole swallowed hard beside the wheelchair. Sweat had formed near his collar despite the cold air conditioning humming through the courtroom vents. "Your Honor," he said carefully, "many records from that era were lost or classified. Mr. Whitaker served during Korea. Verification could take time." "Convenient," the judge replied instantly. Her voice carried the polished cruelty of someone too comfortable behind authority. In the second row, Assistant United States Attorney Nathan Brooks could not stop staring at the old veteran. Something about the name continued pulling at his memory like a loose thread. Whitaker, Korea, Mountain Pass. His father had mentioned that name exactly once during a conversation years ago, after too much bourbon on Christmas Eve. Nathan remembered his father lowering his voice and saying there were men so dangerous and dependable that entire commands survived because they refused to quit. Men whose records disappeared into locked archives because what they did overseas was never supposed to exist publicly. Nathan slowly reached for his phone beneath the table. Meanwhile, Judge Halston leaned forward again, impatience flashing in her eyes. "Bailiff," she ordered coldly. "Escort Mr. Whitaker to the clerk's office and have that medal confiscated until authenticity can be proven." The bailiff hesitated, only for a second, but Thomas Whitaker noticed it immediately. After all these years, he still recognized the exact moment when a good man realized something was very wrong. The hesitation lasted less than a heartbeat, but in a courtroom built on routine and authority, it felt enormous. Bailiff Curtis Brennan stood beside the wheelchair with one hand hovering uncertainly near the old veteran's shoulder. He had spent 14 years working security inside county courts, long enough to recognize liars, scammers, and men trying too hard to look respectable. Thomas Whitaker did not look like any of them. The old man sat perfectly still beneath the pale courtroom lights, his breathing slow and even, his weathered fingers resting against the small metal at his chest, as though it carried the weight of an entire lifetime. "Well," Judge Halston demanded sharply, "do I need to repeat myself?" Brennan cleared his throat quietly. "Sir," he said carefully to Tom, "if you would just come with me for a moment, maybe we can sort this out privately." Tom slowly looked up at him. The veteran's pale blue eyes were calm, but there was something buried deep behind them that made Brennan feel suddenly transparent, like a young patrolman standing inspection before someone far more experienced. "Son," Tom said softly, "that medal has already been through more courts than this one." The words settled heavily into the room. In the gallery, several people exchanged uneasy glances. Nathan Brooks felt a cold knot tighten in his stomach. He had stepped halfway into the hallway now, his phone pressed tightly against his ear while distant office chatter echoed from somewhere deeper inside the courthouse. "Dad," he whispered urgently, "I need you to listen carefully. The man's name is Thomas Whitaker, Korean war veteran, Medal of Honor recipient." Silence answered him for 2 full seconds. Then his father's voice changed completely. "Nathan," retired Colonel Henry Brooks said quietly, "tell me exactly where you are." Back inside the courtroom, Judge Halston's patience had fully curdled into irritation. She leaned forward beneath the courtroom seal, the gold trim of her robe catching the fluorescent glare. "This entire performance is over," she announced. "I have seen enough fake heroes in my courtroom to recognize one when I see one." Ethan Cole visibly flinched beside the wheelchair. Tom Whitaker did not. The old veteran simply turned his eyes once more toward the American flag, standing motionless in the corner. Somewhere in the building, an old ventilation unit rattled softly through the ceiling. The sound reminded him of rotor blades struggling against mountain wind. Snow. Smoke. Frozen radio static. Young Lieutenant James Caldwell collapsing beside him against white stone while dawn slowly crawled over the Korean ridgeline. "You kept coming back for us," the lieutenant had whispered through cracked lips 70 years earlier. "Nobody keeps coming back like that." Tom blinked once, returning to the present. Nathan suddenly re-entered the courtroom, breathing harder now. His face had lost all color. He looked directly at the judge. "Your Honor," he said carefully, "I strongly advise that nobody touches that metal." The courtroom fell so quiet that the low hum of the fluorescent lights suddenly sounded deafening. Nathan Brooks stood near the rear benches with his phone still clutched tightly in his hand, his pulse hammering hard enough to shake his voice. Judge Halston stared down at him with visible annoyance. "Excuse me?" she asked coldly. Nathan swallowed once before answering. "Your Honor, I just spoke with a retired United States Army colonel regarding Mr. Whitaker." The judge leaned back in her chair with a humorless smile. "And now we are consulting retired officers for legal advice." A few uncomfortable chuckles flickered through the room before dying almost instantly. Nathan did not smile. "My father told me there are only a handful of living Medal of Honor recipients from Korea whose records remain partially sealed." His eyes drifted toward the old veteran sitting silently beneath the courtroom lights. "Thomas Whitaker is one of them." Judge Halston's expression hardened immediately. "This court deals in evidence, Mr. Brooks, not family stories." Nathan opened his mouth to answer, but the sound of another phone vibrating interrupted him. It came from his jacket pocket. He glanced down at the screen and felt his stomach tighten. Pentagon. The word alone suddenly made the air inside the courtroom feel thinner. "Take it outside," the judge ordered sharply. Nathan ignored her. Slowly, carefully, he answered the call. "This is Brooks." A crisp voice came through the speaker immediately. "Assistant United States Attorney Nathan Brooks." "Yes, sir. This is Colonel David Mercer, Office of the Joint Chiefs. I need you to listen very carefully." Nathan straightened unconsciously. Across the room, Bailiff Brennan noticed the change in posture instantly. "Military. Nobody," Colonel Mercer continued, "touches Sergeant Major Thomas Whitaker or his medal. Is that understood?" Nathan glanced toward the bench where Judge Halston sat, visibly irritated by the entire interruption. "Sir," Nathan asked quietly, "who exactly is Thomas Whitaker?" The line went silent for one heavy second. Then the colonel answered in a lower voice. "He is the reason General Richard Caldwell is alive." Across the courtroom, Thomas Whitaker remained motionless. The old veteran's eyes rested once again on the American flag standing beneath the courtroom seal, but his mind was somewhere else entirely. Snow whipped across a black mountainside under the pale blue light of dawn. Radios crackled weakly through frozen static. Young Lieutenant James Caldwell had collapsed against the rocks, barely conscious from exposure, while enemy forces closed around the ridge. Tom remembered carrying the lieutenant nearly 3 miles through waist-deep snow with frost gathering on his eyelashes and blood freezing stiff against his sleeves. He remembered the lieutenant trying to apologize for slowing him down. "You do not leave your people behind," Tom had answered back then. Simple, certain, final. Back in the present, Judge Halston slammed her gavel against the bench. "I am done entertaining this nonsense," she snapped. "Bailiff, remove the medal now." Brennan hesitated again, this time longer. Then somewhere far outside the courthouse, faint but unmistakable, came the deep roar of approaching helicopters. The sound grew louder by the second. Deep, rhythmic, powerful enough to vibrate faintly through the courthouse windows. Everyone in courtroom 4B heard it now. Conversations died instantly. Even Judge Halston stopped speaking mid-sentence as the distant thunder of rotor blades rolled across the building from somewhere outside downtown Richmond. Bailiff Brennan slowly turned toward the tall courtroom windows near the hallway doors. "What in the world?" someone whispered from the gallery benches. Nathan Brooks already knew. His face had gone pale beneath the fluorescent lights. Across the room, Thomas Whitaker remained perfectly still in his wheelchair, his weathered hands folded calmly in his lap, as though the approaching storm had nothing to do with him. Judge Halston quickly recovered her composure. "This disruption changes nothing," she announced sharply, gripping her gavel tighter. "This court will proceed." Yet even she sounded less certain now. The rotor noise continued building overhead until faint shadows swept briefly across the courthouse windows. Outside, car alarms somewhere down the block suddenly began chirping in protest from the vibration. Nathan's phone buzzed once more. Another incoming call from Colonel Mercer. He answered immediately. "Sir, they are 3 minutes out," the colonel said calmly. "Advise courthouse security not to interfere." Nathan glanced toward the bailiff. Brennan had already stepped closer, his instincts clearly shifting from courtroom procedure into something else entirely. Respect, caution, awareness. "Sir," Nathan asked quietly, "who exactly is coming?" The answer arrived without hesitation. "The chairman of the Joint Chiefs." Nathan felt the blood drain from his face. Around him, the stale courtroom air suddenly felt electric. Judge Halston noticed his expression immediately. "Mr. Brooks," she snapped impatiently, "if you cannot maintain professionalism, you may leave my courtroom." Nathan looked at her carefully. "Your Honor," he said slowly, "with all due respect, I do not believe this is your courtroom anymore." The words landed like a crack of thunder. A wave of murmurs swept through the gallery benches. Ethan Cole stared at Nathan in disbelief, while Bailiff Brennan unconsciously straightened his posture near the aisle. Decades of instinctive respect for rank had kicked in before his mind fully processed why. Thomas Whitaker quietly closed his eyes for a brief moment as the rotor noise above stirred another memory loose from deep inside him. Snow drifted through black pine trees beneath the pale dawn sky of Korea. Young Lieutenant James Caldwell shivered violently beside a dying field radio, while enemy patrol lights moved slowly through the valley below. Tom remembered removing his own gloves and forcing them into the lieutenant's frozen hands despite the brutal cold biting into his skin. "You will make it home, sir," he had said quietly back then. "That is not optimism. That is an order." Back in the present, courthouse doors somewhere down the hall suddenly burst open. Heavy footsteps echoed through marble corridors. Sharp, fast, disciplined. Then came the unmistakable sound of military dress, shoes striking polished tile with absolute purpose. The heavy footsteps stopped just outside the courtroom doors. For one suspended moment, nobody inside courtroom 4B seemed willing to breathe. Then the doors swung open with sharp mechanical force, and 2 military police officers entered first in full dress uniform, their polished shoes striking the marble floor with precise rhythm. Behind them walked a tall man with silver hair cut close to the scalp and 4 stars gleaming beneath the fluorescent lights on the shoulders of his dark Army service uniform. General Richard Caldwell. Every instinct inside the room shifted instantly. Bailiff Brennan straightened so fast his chair scraped loudly against the floor. Nathan Brooks stepped backward without realizing it. Even the conversations from the hallway outside seemed to disappear beneath the crushing gravity that followed the 4-star general into the room. Judge Halston blinked once, visibly caught off guard by the sudden arrival. "What is the meaning of this?" she demanded, though her voice lacked the certainty it carried only minutes earlier. General Caldwell did not answer her. He never even looked toward the bench. Instead, his eyes locked immediately onto the elderly man seated quietly at the center of the courtroom. Thomas Whitaker slowly lifted his head. For the first time since the hearing began, something faint moved across the old veteran's weathered face. Recognition. The general crossed the room in long measured steps. The ribbons on his chest caught the overhead lights with every movement. Nobody spoke. Nobody dared interrupt. When General Caldwell finally stopped in front of the wheelchair, the courtroom seemed to freeze around him. Then, without hesitation, the chairman of the Joint Chiefs stood perfectly straight and raised his hand in a full military salute. The sound of his glove brushing against the brim of his service cap was barely audible, Yet it echoed through the silent courtroom louder than any gavel ever could. Gasps spread across the gallery benches. Ethan Cole stared in open disbelief. Bailiff Brennan instinctively moved to attention beside the aisle. Nathan Brooks felt chills crawl up both arms. Thomas Whitaker looked up at the general for several quiet seconds before slowly returning the salute, with trembling fingers stiffened by age and winter injuries that never fully healed. General Caldwell lowered his hand carefully. His voice, when it came, was low and steady. "Good to see you again, Sergeant Major." Tom gave the faintest nod. "You finally made full bird, Lieutenant." A few stunned laughs escaped the gallery before dying immediately beneath the weight of realization. Judge Halston gripped her gavel tighter. "General Caldwell," she interrupted sharply. "This courtroom is in session and I demand an explanation for this disruption." For the first time since entering, the general turned toward the bench. His pale gray eyes were calm, but something inside them carried the cold stillness of a man who had spent decades commanding wars. "Disruption?" he repeated quietly. Then he glanced toward Thomas Whitaker's medal resting against the old veteran's chest. "Ma'am," he said carefully, "that man carried me through a blizzard in North Korea after half my platoon disappeared off that mountain." The room went dead silent again. Then the general added 4 words that made Judge Halston's face lose all color. "I owe him everything." No one moved after those words. The silence inside courtroom 4B became something physical, heavy enough to press against every chest in the room. Judge Halston sat frozen behind the bench, one hand still wrapped around her gavel while the other slowly loosened against the polished wood. General Richard Caldwell remained standing before Thomas Whitaker's wheelchair, his posture rigid with the kind of discipline that never leaves a career soldier, even after decades of command. The old veteran looked up at him quietly, pale blue eyes reflecting memories neither man needed to explain aloud. Outside, the distant rotor noise still echoed faintly through downtown Richmond, but inside the courtroom there was only silence and the soft hum of fluorescent lights overhead. Nathan Brooks watched the scene with stunned disbelief. All morning he had thought he was witnessing another ugly courtroom dispute. Another old man buried beneath paperwork and bureaucracy. Now he realized he was standing in front of living military history. Judge Halston finally cleared her throat. "General Caldwell," she began carefully. "With respect, this court cannot simply suspend procedure based on personal sentiment." The general turned toward her slowly. Calmly. "Sentiment?" he repeated. His voice remained controlled, but every word carried the weight of command. "Ma'am, Sergeant Major Whitaker held a frozen mountain pass for 6 hours while wounded men were evacuated behind him." The courtroom remained motionless. Even the reporters near the backbenches had stopped typing. "The only reason I survived Korea," Caldwell continued quietly, "is because that man refused to leave anyone behind." Thomas Whitaker lowered his eyes slightly, almost uncomfortable with the attention. That small movement said more about him than any speech ever could. Ethan Cole noticed it immediately. The old veteran was not proud of the medal. He carried it the way some men carried scars. Necessary. Permanent. Heavy. Judge Halston attempted to recover control of the room. "Regardless of military service," she said carefully, "this court still requires verification of authenticity." General Caldwell stared at her for a long moment before reaching into the inner pocket of his service jacket. He removed a small leather credential case embossed with the seal of the Department of Defense. Without breaking eye contact, he placed it gently on the clerk's desk. "Verification," he said softly. "I signed the renewal authorization for his military records personally." The clerk opened the credential packet with visibly shaking hands. Inside rested official Pentagon documents stamped with federal seals and decades-old commendation records. The courtroom clerk's eyes widened almost immediately. "Oh my God," she whispered under her breath. Nathan Brooks watched Judge Halston's face slowly lose color as the realization finally settled in. The medal was real. The stories were real. The quiet old man she had mocked all morning had once carried future generals through snowstorms while the world froze around them. General Caldwell looked back toward Thomas Whitaker, and his expression softened slightly for the first time since entering the room. "You know," he said quietly, "my grandchildren still think you are a myth." A faint smile touched the corner of Tom's weathered face. "That is probably for the best, Lieutenant." Then the old veteran's eyes drifted once more toward the American flag in the corner as another memory rose quietly behind them. Snow, wind, radio static. Young soldiers huddled beneath white camouflage blankets, while one exhausted sergeant major stood alone, watching the mountain ridge through the freezing dark. The energy inside the courtroom had completely changed now. What began that morning as a routine hearing wrapped in irritation and bureaucracy had turned into something nobody present would ever forget. Reporters near the back benches stared silently at the Pentagon documents spread across the clerk's desk. The courtroom clerk herself looked overwhelmed as she carefully turned each aging page beneath trembling fingers. Official commendations, deployment records, presidential citations. Every seal authentic, every signature real. Judge Halston remained motionless behind the bench, but the confidence that once filled her voice had vanished entirely. General Caldwell stood beside Thomas Whitaker's wheelchair like a silent guard post that could not be moved. The old veteran himself looked almost detached from the entire scene, his pale eyes drifting quietly across the room as if he had already spent a lifetime watching people realize too late who they were speaking to. Bailiff Brennan slowly approached the wheelchair again, but this time there was no authority in his movement. Only respect. Sergeant Major, he said quietly, I owe you an apology. Tom looked up at the younger man. Deep lines shifted gently across his weathered face. No, you do not, son, he answered softly. You hesitated. That matters. Brennan swallowed hard and stepped back slightly, visibly affected by the words. Nathan Brooks remained near the aisle, still trying to process everything unfolding before him. Sir, he finally asked General Caldwell carefully, what actually happened on that mountain? The general was silent for several moments. When he finally spoke, his voice carried the distant weight of memory. Our convoy was trapped north of the chosen reservoir during a whiteout storm, he said quietly. Visibility dropped below 20 feet. Communications failed. Most of us were barely standing from the cold. The room listened in complete silence. Lieutenant Caldwell, Tom interrupted gently without looking at the general, you always exaggerate. A faint smile touched Caldwell's face. No, Sergeant Major. If anything, I have spent 70 years understating it. The general glanced toward the courtroom windows where pale winter sunlight now stretched across the marble floor. There were 31 men left on that ridge, he continued. By sunrise, only one of them was still walking patrols through the snow to keep the rest awake. Nathan felt chills crawl down his spine. Ethan Cole lowered his eyes quietly. Even Judge Halston no longer attempted to interrupt. Tom Whitaker shifted slightly in his wheelchair, uncomfortable beneath the growing attention. We all carried each other, he said simply. That is how soldiers survive. But General Caldwell slowly shook his head. No, Sergeant Major, he answered softly. You carried all of us. The silence that followed felt almost sacred. Outside, the rotor noise had faded now, replaced by distant city traffic and the soft tapping of rain beginning against the courthouse windows. Thomas Whitaker listened to the rain for a moment, and another memory quietly surfaced behind his pale blue eyes. Snow falling through darkness. Exhausted young soldiers huddled beside frozen radios. A 20-year-old sergeant major standing alone against the wind while a frightened lieutenant asked him one impossible question. How do you keep going when everyone else wants to quit? Tom remembered staring into the white storm before answering with words that never left him. Because somebody has to make it home first. Rain tapped steadily against the courthouse windows now, soft and constant, washing the city outside in pale gray light. Inside Courtroom 4B, nobody seemed eager to speak first. The atmosphere had transformed completely from what it had been only an hour earlier. The tension was gone. In its place sat something heavier. Respect. Judge Margaret Halston slowly removed her glasses and placed them carefully on the bench before her. For the first time all morning, she looked directly at Thomas Whitaker without irritation or authority hiding behind her expression. Only realization. Sergeant Major, she said quietly, her voice no longer sharp, this court owes you an apology. Tom looked toward her calmly. His pale blue eyes carried no anger, no triumph, only exhaustion earned across far too many winters. Ma'am, he answered softly, you do not owe me anything. The simplicity of the words seemed to affect the room more than outrage ever could. Nathan Brooks lowered his eyes for a moment while Bailiff Brennan stood silently beside the aisle, his posture still unconsciously straightened from the presence of the four-star general. Ethan Cole slowly sat back into his chair, still trying to process how an elderly veteran accused of wearing a fake medal had turned out to be the man who once carried the future chairman of the Joint Chiefs through a frozen battlefield. General Caldwell finally exhaled quietly and glanced toward the courtroom clock. "Thomas," he said gently, "there are people at the Pentagon who would give anything to see you again." Tom gave the faintest shake of his head. "I already buried most of the people I wanted to see." The words settled heavily into the silence. Outside, thunder rolled softly somewhere far beyond the rain clouds. General Caldwell nodded once, understanding more than anyone else in the room possibly could. He remembered the young sergeant major from Korea, standing watch through blizzard winds while exhausted soldiers slept beside frozen radios. He remembered a man who never raised his voice, never asked for recognition, never spoke about courage because to him it had simply been duty. The general looked down at the faded Medal of Honor resting against Tom Whitaker's chest. "You know," he said quietly, "there is a hall at the Pentagon filled with portraits of heroes." Tom glanced toward him with tired eyes. "That building already has enough paintings." A faint smile crossed Caldwell's face. Then, slowly and deliberately, the four-star general stepped beside the wheelchair and placed one steady hand against the back handle. "At least let me escort you out, Sergeant Major." The old veteran looked toward the rain-covered courthouse windows for a long moment before finally nodding once. Together, the two men turned toward the courtroom doors. Every person inside the room stood instinctively as they passed. No order was given. Nobody needed one. Reporters lowered their cameras. Court clerks stepped aside silently. Even Judge Halston rose from behind the bench as Thomas Whitaker rolled slowly past beneath the soft fluorescent lights. At the doorway, Tom paused briefly beside the American flag, standing in the corner. His weathered hand lifted carefully into one final salute before he disappeared into the hallway beside the general. The room remained silent long after they were gone. Because some men do not need to demand respect. They carry it with them long after the world forgets how it was earned.